We are continuing in our series, Enemies of the Heart. Our aim throughout this series is to explore and monitor the condition of our heart by looking at 4 emotions: anger, fear, greed, and envy. These 4 emotions have potential to erode our character, wreak havoc in our relationships, and even debilitate our faith. Although it can be challenging to examine our hearts, this is such an important process for our overall well-being. And so for today, we will be exploring the emotion of fear. In October, we celebrated what is quickly becoming one of my favorite holidays, Halloween. I love this holiday because I get to spend time with my kids, and I love all the costumes and dressing up, as well as connecting with neighbors that I don't normally get a chance to talk to. But one of the things that I love and hate about our neighborhood is that people go all out for Halloween. Now, I love this because many of the houses are decked out with decorations, they give out tons of candy, and it just feels like there's a big block party happening. But I hate this because there's a lot of creepy animatronics that move and make these horrendous sounds. And I'm definitely not one of those people that enjoy being scared. Like, you won't catch me in a haunted house or a creepy corn maze anytime soon. And as much as I try to avoid these creepy animatronics, it never fails that I end up getting spooked by at least one while we're out. And there's nothing worse than that feeling of, oh my gosh, I'm gonna die. But then you realize, like, I'm fine, everything's gonna be okay. Now, as we begin looking at the emotion of fear, I want us to consider that there are 2 types of fears that we experience. The first one is what I experienced on Halloween. It's fear induced by a perceived threat. When this happens, our body responds in specific ways like sweating, increased heart rate, high adrenaline that causes extreme alertness. Now, this is the biochemical reaction that is known as the fight or flight response, which is preparing us to confront the danger or run away, and this is crucial to our survival. But there's another side to fear that's not responding to immediate threats in our environment. And instead of it keeping us safe, this fear tends to keep us stuck. This is the type of fear that is the hypothetical scenarios that play out in our mind, or the what-if thoughts that can consume us. And these fears often solely exist in our imagination, but they can influence and impact us in much the same way a true threat would. Now, this type of fear is a universal experience, but we can get stuck in a cycle of dread, worry, and anxiety because of our fears. Now, we live in a world where we have access to so much information. And in one sense, this is great because we're more aware of what's happening around us. But it's also terrible because we're more aware of what's happening around us. When we hear about a tragedy that's happened thousands of miles from us, it feels like it's happening right in our own backyard. We're inundated with polarizing messages that if something specific happens, it will ruin everything. And even if you try to avoid these fear-inducing messages, it never fails that you have that one person in your life that loves sharing all the tragic news they've heard lately. It just feels like you can't escape it. And because of this, fear can take root in our hearts, and the world begins to feel unstable and dangerous. But there's another side to this emotion that doesn't come from news headlines, but comes from our own life experience. Each of us has gone through loss and suffering and sorrow of some kind that sticks with us, and it can produce fear that influence how we see and respond to our environment. For example, we may fear being seen for who we truly are because we've felt the sting of rejection. We may fear failure because we felt the shame of it the last time we failed. We fear close relationships because what if someone hurts me again? And then there's the what if thoughts that we struggle with. We fear losing control because what if things go wrong? We fear not making the right decision because what if we let everyone down? We fear illness because what if it ruins our life? We fear loss because what if we can't go on without that person or that thing that we hold so dear? And because of all these fears, we can become immobilized and stuck in a cycle of protecting ourselves from truly living our lives and experiencing the freedom of our faith. So before we go any further, I want you to take a quick inventory. What are the fears that you're facing right now? Perhaps you're facing something unknown, and the anticipation of what's going to happen is making you afraid. Or you're struggling with the what if thoughts, and they're keeping you awake at night. Do you feel anxious about something and it's keeping you stuck? Are you experiencing feelings of an impending doom? What are the fears that you're having right now? Well, I'm sure each of us can identify something, and this is good because awareness is our first step towards freedom. And the good news is that this is not something new to the human experience. Throughout Jesus' ministry, he encountered so many people that were afraid. The religious leaders were afraid of losing power because of Jesus' influence. Townspeople were afraid of Jesus because he disrupted what they were familiar with. And the disciples struggled with fear because they couldn't understand Jesus' words and actions. But it was the disciple Peter who went through a very relatable journey of being led by fear to living in the freedom of faith. So today, I want us to look at 3 examples from Peter's life that will show us some steps that we can take when we're struggling with fear. Now, we're going to be starting in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14. This is the first book in the New Testament. But to give us some context, in this passage, we read about Jesus' miracle feeding a few thousand people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. It was pretty crazy. And shortly after this miracle, Jesus asked the disciples, go ahead, get in the boat, cross the lake, and he would catch up with them on the other side. And then Jesus, he goes to a quiet place to pray, to have some alone time. But after this alone time, perhaps a few hours later, he notices that his disciples were struggling to cross this massive body of water because of high winds. And that's where we'll pick up in our reading, starting in verse 25, Matthew 14. Shortly after dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began sinking. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" The disciples are experiencing another mind-blowing miracle of Jesus as he walks towards them on water in the middle of this windy lake. But we read that they were afraid. Although Jesus is not a threat to them, he's doing something that's unknown to them. And because of this, it causes them to cry out in fear. Now, we experience moments like this too. One of the greatest fears people experience is the fear of the unknown. When we're in an environment that we're unfamiliar with, when we're faced with a decision we're uncertain about, or when we do something that we've never done before, we can experience irrational fear about what's going to happen. But then Peter, he cries out, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." I appreciate the humanity in Peter's statement when he says, "Lord, if it's you." When we're facing unknowns, we often challenge God with this question. It might not sound exactly like this, but we say things like, "God, if you really care, you'll show me." Or, "God, if you want me to do this, then tell me." "God, if this is from you, then prove it to me." And we wait for a sign from heaven to confirm what we need to do or reassure us that we're headed in the right direction so we can have 100% certainty. Now, I love the simplicity of Jesus' response to Peter. He says, "Come." Now, what I love about this is that Jesus could have said so many things to reassure Peter, but all he says is, "Move." Like I shared earlier, our fears can often keep us stuck. We don't want to make the wrong decision. We don't want to risk looking dumb. We don't want to step into the unknown. And instead of living boldly, we want to wait for the perfect clarity that never truly comes. But in this moment, we see that despite Peter's fear of the unknown, Jesus says, "Move. I want you to move." Now, one of the greatest unknowns that I've experienced in my walk with God was when I was asked to preach my first sermon to a group of women back in 2016. Now, at this point, I had led devotionals and facilitated group Bible studies, but I had never prepared a message before. I can't even begin to tell you how many fears crept into my mind. Like, am I even allowed to teach the Bible? Like, what if I say something dumb? What if I freeze and I can't get my words out? What if people don't take me seriously? And so I did what every good Christian does. I asked advice from every single person that I know in my life about whether I should do it. But no matter how many times people reassured me, just go for it, I was still consumed with this fear that I was going to completely fail. But then I remembered what the Spirit of God had spoken to me a few months earlier, and I believe that that word was intended for me for this very moment. A few months earlier, at the start of the new year, I felt in my spirit that this was a year of yes, and specifically saying yes to the things that I was passionate about. There was no more watching from the sidelines. There was no more excuses about why I couldn't do something. There was no more doubting myself. I just needed to say yes. And so I said yes to my first message, and I gotta say, I was a hot mess. I can't tell you if it was good or bad because I blacked out through the whole thing. But that invitation to move, that invitation to participate, it led me into things that God had been preparing for me to do. And I'm so grateful that I didn't let the fear of the unknown keep me stuck in the safety of what was familiar. And one of the things I've come to learn is that the pathway to our greatest potential, it's often through our fear. And this is what happened to Peter. He got out of the boat, he walked on water. I can't even imagine how incredible that must have been. But then we read that Peter noticed how crazy the environment was around him. He became afraid and he began to sink. Jesus, he immediately catches him and he says this line, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Now, at first glance, this statement from Jesus, it seems a little harsh. After all, Jesus, he walked on water. That doesn't seem like little faith to me. But if we understand the heart of Jesus, then we know that he wasn't shaming Peter. So what exactly was he communicating in this statement? Well, have you ever heard the phrase, "let your faith be greater than your fear"? Although this is a great sentiment, when I hear it, it feels a little out of touch because if only it was that simple. You know, I'm experiencing fear. I just need to replace it with more faith. Done. But it's never quite that simple, is it? Well, in this moment, Jesus' words to Peter are kind of similar to that phrase, but he's trying to help Peter realize is that he is trusting in his fear more than he was trusting in Jesus. Even though Jesus told Peter to join him on the water, as soon as he noticed the commotion around him, his fear kicked in and he began to doubt Jesus' trustworthiness. Have you ever experienced something like this? You take that risk, you put yourself out there, you say a prayer and give it to God, and then things seem to be going smoothly until you start to encounter challenges. You begin having issues with people around you. Provision doesn't come the way you think it would. Your plans don't turn out. And when this happens, we're tempted to turn to those fears and trust our doubts that have been lingering in our head all the while. I knew it wasn't worth it. I knew I wasn't cut out for this. I knew I shouldn't have trusted God. And we begin to trust the narrative and the skepticism of our fears more than we trust what God has spoken to us. But when this happens, just like Jesus' words to Peter, he is asking us to focus our eyes back on him. Now, again, I know this isn't simple. Often when fears pop up, they come from legitimate issues or a situation that we're facing or something that we have experienced in our past. And so we want to find a way to protect ourselves, to keep ourselves safe. And there's a time and place for that. Sometimes our environment is toxic and we need to get out of it. Sometimes things that we set out to do aren't best for us. But more often, we are in situations where we're right where we need to be. Even though it's challenging, even though there's uncertainty, even though it doesn't go the way we thought. This is why Jesus says, please keep your eyes fixed on me. See, Jesus knew we would have to wrestle with this tension between the fear of our situation or the fear of our past and the reality of God's faithfulness. And this is why near the end of his time with his disciples, he would tell them in John 16, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." It was important for Jesus to not mince words when he told the disciples that they would endure hardships, because he knew if he wasn't clear about this, when they went through moments of suffering, that they would fear that God had abandoned them, or that they weren't on the right path, or maybe they should give up. But Jesus says, hey, when stuff's going down, don't lose faith, because I have overcome the world. And how did Jesus overcome the world? With brute force or coercion? No. He overcame through sacrificial love. So keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus means that we focus on the love of God, the love that is bringing restoration, that's providing mercy, that is our source of peace, that is in the business of resurrected life, not only for us, but for the world. And this is what we keep our eyes fixed on. Take heart. Love has and will overcome this world. And this leads us to the next moment in Peter's journey of wrestling with fear. When Jesus was eventually arrested and sentenced to torture and execution of the Roman cross, the disciples experienced a surge of fear. In Matthew 26, shortly after Jesus' arrest, Peter faced his first opportunity to live out the things that Jesus had prepared for him. Let's read that now, if you want to join me. Chapter 26, verse 69. Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. "You also were with Jesus of Galilee," she said. But he denied it before all of them. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Then he went out to the gateway, where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." He denied it again with an oath, "I don't know the man." After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know the man." Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the words Jesus had spoken, "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. After everything that he had witnessed Jesus do, after all the time that they had spent together, after everything Jesus had shared with him, Peter rejected Jesus because he was afraid. And in his fear, it was legit. He could have been brutally whipped or even executed if he had said that he was one of Jesus's followers. See, sometimes our fears do get the best of us. Sometimes it keeps us from speaking up. Sometimes it keeps us in hiding. Sometimes our fears consume our hearts. But thankfully, Jesus doesn't hold that against us. In the Gospel of John 21, we read that after Jesus' death and resurrection, that he would seek Peter out to reassure him that not only was he still loved, but get this, he was still worthy of doing the things that God was calling him to do. Now, I just want to pause here and say, if fear has immobilized you recently and led you down a path that makes you feel distant from God or disconnected from the passions that you have, I hope you know that you are unconditionally loved by God. And also, it is never too late to continue in your life-giving purpose. And that is exactly what Peter lived through. After Jesus restored him, we see this significant shift in boldness in his life. And this leads us to our final moment in Peter's journey of wrestling with fear. Now, in the book of Acts, we have the early church, and we get this firsthand look at the progression of the timid disciple Peter morphing into the bold apostle Peter. After he witnessed not only the resurrected Savior, but he experienced the redemption of God's love, it changed everything. In the book of Acts, we see him preaching to crowds. He's instructing the new followers about what it means to live out the good news. He even performed a miracle by healing a crippled man. Peter is living in his boldly living for Jesus era. In Acts chapter 4, we read that shortly after Peter healed the crippled man, he continues to preach about the resurrection, and he's calling people to put their faith in Jesus. But the religious leaders who heard what he was doing and saying, they were so disturbed by this that they put both Peter and the Apostle John in jail for that night. Now, the next day, they were brought before this crowd of religious aristocrats and Jewish council, and they were asked to give an account for the blasphemous words that they had been saying and their actions. Now, this was an extremely intimidating environment. This group of people, they were wealthy, educated, had influence and power. But Peter, when he faced this group of people, he should have been afraid, but he was overcome in his faith with Jesus. Now, starting in chapter 4, verse 8, he began preaching to them. And he said this to them. He said, "The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." In other words, the person that you had crucified is actually the Savior of the world. And let's read how they respond, starting in verse 13. So after Peter preaches to them, this is what they say. When they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. What I want us to see from this verse is the word courage. It was the courage of Peter and John that caught their attention, because as ordinary, unschooled men, they should not be speaking and living so boldly, yet their courage in the face of fear, it astonished them. And you want to know something so beautiful is that Jesus told Peter this all the way back during the boat incident. When the disciples saw Jesus walking on the water and they were afraid, Jesus said, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." I've always loved the quote, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear." And this is what I felt when I taught my first message. I was so afraid, but my love for God and my desire for others to experience His love became greater than my fear. And I wish I could say that that fear has gone away. But to this day, I still wrestle with fear when I'm preparing to preach. But I have found something more important than my fear. And this is what Peter encountered as he stood before the Sanhedrin. I know that there was a part of him that was afraid. He was still Peter, but he found courage because of his love for God, and his love for humanity was more important. See, our goal is not to get to a place where we don't struggle with fear, because the truth is we will always have fears in our lives, but we can get to a point like the Apostle Peter, where having courage means you don't let fear stop you. You don't let it stop you from loving people. You don't let it stop you from being loved. Don't let fear rob us from the hope we have in Jesus. So from the life of Peter, what we see is that we can begin fearing less by keeping our eyes fixed on the restorative nature of God, a God who is working in the brokenness, and a God who will not give up on humanity. And we can begin fearing less by having courage, by focusing on something that is more important than our fear. Now, I don't know where you're at today. Perhaps you're feeling stuck, or it feels like the world is going to crumble around you, or you're resisting stepping into what God is calling you to because of your fear. And although the feelings of fear that we are experiencing, although they may have legitimacy, there is a way to feel this emotion without it keeping us stuck, without it keeping us afraid, guarded, and even hurtful to those around us. And I hope today that we can take one step out of our what-if thoughts and our hypothetical scenarios that are living rent-free, those thoughts that are robbing us from living and loving boldly. And instead, we would focus on God's love that does drive out fear. Will you bow your heads with me, and I'll pray. Father, I pray that your kingdom that is good, your kingdom that is for the hurting, your kingdom that is in the business of restoration, that your kingdom would come, that we would experience it here on earth as it is in heaven. Lord, I pray that in our fear, that you would help us to keep our eyes fixed on you, that you would help us to find courage by focusing on something that is more important, love. God, this isn't simple. This isn't a simple calling. And so we ask for your strength. We ask for your help. We ask for your provision. And I pray that we would be a light into this world that is hope, that is comfort, that helps those around us. Father, help us to love the way you have loved us. And I pray this in the mighty name of Jesus. Amen.